Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And welcome to a conversation that has been at least months in the making, but really feels like years in the making. And I think in actuality, it has been. This is a conversation with one of my dear teachers, who I also consider a friend, somebody that has influenced my life in really beautiful ways. And I'm excited to introduce some of you to Yoga Rupa if you haven't met him before, or to perhaps give you a reintroduction, um, a way back in, perhaps, to being able to study and learn with him as teacher and as human.
Mhm.
So my heart is
Thank you.
racing right
Thank you,
now.
Natalie. Thank you
You're
for that
so
introduction.
you're
I'm
so
honored and thrilled to be here. And indeed, this has been years in the making. We were just briefly talking. I'm going to let you follow up, but just briefly talking about when this particular teaching came alive for you. And you pointed to Bali. What is we both identified? I think it was 2018. And so it is years in the making. And so let's begin. I'm really looking forward to this. Yeah.
As am I. And I can tell that we're doing the right thing at the right time in the right place because my heart is like beating out of my chest. And that's often a validation that something wants to move through. So
Mhm. Mhm.
here it is. um, let's give you a little bit of framework for the conversation. We're going to be talking about a sutra from chapter 1 of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras that has come to be definitive for me in terms of how I orient myself to my practice and very much how I orient myself to life. It is like my guardrail, if you will, for me to be able to check in and see how things are going in terms of the efficacy of my practice and the way that that is influencing how I show up in the world. And that is Sutra 133. And if you have practiced with me a lot or studied with me, participated in any of my teacher trainings, you are familiar with Sutra 133. And yet there is still so much more to explore and unpack. I was first introduced to Sutra 133 by Yoga Rupa in Bali. And I was sitting in a shala, a beautiful shala, surrounded by probably 100 colleagues from around the world. And we were all there to learn. I think a lot of times we attend those trainings in order to learn something new to then share with our students. But
Mhm.
there was something about this one that felt very different from the get go. And for me, the difference arrived in the way that Yoga Rupa introduced the content. And he was saying that he had been working with his, most core group of students, perhaps, for a very extended period of time. And these were very devoted and quite advanced practitioners in terms of the philosophy that they were familiar with and the methodologies that they were engaging with. And yet, something seemed to still be not quite clicking in terms of how they were engaging with their humanity, maybe for lack of a better word. And I'll let you fill in the gap there if you'd like to, because I don't remember your exact phrasing, but I do remember that what you said really made me like sit up straighter in my seat and invest quite a bit more in the whole training. And it was pretty intense. There was a lot of deep reflection, a lot of soul searching.
Mhm.
That was a time when contemplation, I really started to understand the necessity, the role that that plays in our development. Um, and since then, it has continued to play a very important role. So again, thank you for that. Um, so that's how it entered my life, and I sat with this sutra and just continued to mull it over for at least a good year after that, of just knowing it was still working on me in some way. And shortly after that, in a lot of ways, the external world kind of exploded. My internal world exploded. There was a lot of upheaval and yeah, a lot of demonstration of a lot of what we'll be talking about in terms of mental contaminants and how those can leak out into our lives. And so it gave me a fantastic opportunity to apply what we'd been studying and practicing with as my best means for navigation. So,
Natalie, thank you so much. I mean, if I can, I think maybe it'd just be helpful early on in the conversation if we just create just a little bit of context, because some people may actually not be familiar with Yoga Sutra. So this is a text almost 2,000 years old, appears appears at a really a critical time. The Buddha has already been on Earth for about 4 centuries, but you know, most of the Buddha's teachings go further east, initially arising in India. But the point was that this great sage, who is sometimes referred as the ultimate of all seers of the yoga tradition, and let's be clear, he actually defines the beginning of the yoga tradition. And to be clear now, it's a seminal text, roughly 196 statements. They're all pretty pithy because they all required commentary. There were no printing presses in those days. And also, he tried to distill the very essence of what yoga was in terms of its definition. What is it? What is the state of yoga? What does that look like? And in the simplest terms, he began in the, I want to say genius. There was a kind of genius and elegance and both complexity and simplicity in what he presented. But the whole point was to create this distillation, a text that created as concise an understanding of the vast schools of yoga all in one body. But that, by the way, just so everyone knows what we're really getting into here, there's only 4 statements about asana in the whole text out of 196. There's 6 about God. And now there's 4 about breathing. And so, what's this gap between God and the ultimate reality, our bodies, and our breathing? Well, the mind. And the mind is everything. Like the Buddha, Patanjali is all about perception, like the way we see ourselves, the way we see our own life experience, the way we interpret it, the way we interpret and respond or react to life outside of us. It's all determined by the quality of our perception. This is ultimately a map into understanding perception and how perception can be optimized so that we have the greatest amount of free will as well as clarity about who we actually are and what life is.
Mhm.
And finally, I would say ultimately it's also a book, a scripture about how we move through both the inner and the outer worlds as elegantly as we possibly can. I don't want to say effortlessly, but that we can bring calm and tranquility with us. And I would just add, I close that thought with, I think that speaks to its relevance now as much as ever. So that's a little bit, so we all have a common language and a common context for what the Yoga Sutra is. And the last thing, oh, one more last thing to say. Unfortunately, it's written in such a pithy way that if you don't have a good commentary in front of you, it's almost impossible to decode what he was saying. You can think you know, but it's quite of it's quite packed. So it was the only way, again, 196 statements could do the summary of the potential of yoga.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I tried to read a copy of it without any commentary whatsoever when I first started practicing yoga asana. And I thought, well, where does it start? Where does it mention warrior two?
Right,
And
right.
yeah, I read it cover to cover and I got nothing out of it because no commentary, no context. Yeah, and I think we've been very fortunate to have access to so many wonderful commentaries now on top of Vyasa's commentary. And Vyasa is another great master who provided sort of the initial and sort of overriding commentary that really helps us to kind of decode a lot of what
Yeah.
Patanjali wrote. What's your favorite commentary or one that you often refer back to?
I wouldn't recommend it for beginners, but I do think Pandit Rajmani Toganayat's The Secret of the Sutras is it. But I also think you have to build your way up to it. I think that if it would be a very all but impossible one to start with.
Mm.
Um, y- y- Unfortunately, that means that if you take an example like 4 chapters on freedom, you're actually going to have to unlearn a few things because there's it stretches. It doesn't necessarily have the same level of clarity throughout the text, and it kind of pulls things into its own perspective. That's one of my favorite. I know a lot of people love the Satchidananda commentary. So just if you can graduate to the secret of the sutras, know that eventually the secrets of the sutras are going to turn everything you learned previously upside down. But for me, that is the one.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to again say, again, for those listening in and either new to me or old to me or new to you or new to this conversation, and what I think excites us to have this conversation, Natalie and I, and that it is its relevance now more than ever.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you wanted me to speak into that thing that was happening, what I was seeing in 2018. And I actually, it began a couple years earlier. And I started to have, at the time, I was teaching all over the world a lot and a lot of students. Um, and this thing was happening where I began to receive these comments from new students who are coming into, say, these rooms of 100 people and then going, wow, love these teachings, love being kind of introduced or having them decoded or clarified, but I don't always feel comfortable socially.
Mm.
And that started to happen. In other words, the environment felt either cliquish or that there was judgment or that there was hierarchy. And after you receive 3, 5, 10, 20 comments, I was a little blind to it, to be honest with you. And it was helpful to hear this feedback from outsiders. And I began to reflect on it and see it. And, human beings are quite capable of extending the dynamics of high school for the rest of their life. In fact, the more I learn about the brain and neuroscience, that's actually our nature is if our survival is okay, we've kind of addressed survival or scarcity. The next thing we'll do is create clicks, little in crowd, out crowd thing. And then in that recognition of what I was seeing as the gap in people's practice and dedication and discipline, as you said, very learned, super aware of the esoterica of the wisdom, but there was something missing in its expression as actively active embodiment of yoga. And you and I are going to get to that shortly, I think, what that looks like, what that is. That to me is what began. And then that's when I went back and I realized, oh, what we're missing is this fundamental teaching. And that's when I started to, bring it out because frankly, I'd never really taught it before. We taught around it, but not really emphasized it to the degree that I realized that culture was heading in a particular direction around division and othering. We'll put it that way. It was growing animus in our culture and in environment and internally, growing judgment of others. And it's not an accident that when you look at great spiritual beings who are alive, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, but there's only so many. We see in them immense capacity for forgiveness, immense and intentional effort toward acceptance and non-judgment, even those with different views than ours.
Mhm.
And so, anyway, this teaching that Natalie, you got lit on fire, and I've watched your commitment to it and spreading word of it and essentially giving the teaching around it for several years now, and you being so passionate about it. And it's been an amazing thing to observe and watch. And I'm really appreciative of you taking a real really investing yourself in modern students understanding this critical piece of the inner culture of embodying yoga.
Yeah. Yeah. I find myself wondering, what's the point without it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Shall we tell them
Yeah.
what it is?
Yeah, please. We've talked about it. Now let's get into it.
Yeah. So Sutra 133 highlights the four most potent mental contaminants that impact every human being with a mind. And these contaminants are pointed out so that we can keep our eyes open to their presence and their influence over us. And not just the way that we behave externally, although there's very clear evidence that if we're nurturing these contaminants or ignoring their presence, then it comes out into the way that we interact with the world. But also, what I find really fascinating and compelling is that it's addressing us as practitioner, as meditator. If these mental contaminants are not checked and not administered to, healed in essence, then they will become our primary obstacles to this ultimate aim of becoming essentially dissolved back into the divine. So it's critical for our practice that we look at these contaminants and we apply their antidote. And then, like essentially everything else that at least I have studied through the Yoga Sutras, by doing that inner work of healing and clarifying and purifying, it then ripples out into the way that we impact the rest of the world just by living.
Mhm.
So to me, it's just such an imperative double whammy. Like this is something that we absolutely must engage with in order to become a living, breathing embodiment of these philosophies and the promise of maximizing our humanity. I think really gets fulfilled if we're willing to do this kind of work.
To be clear, the double whammy is, as I understand you just described it, one is where we can go in our own practice
Mhm.
is impacted. Even the depth, the most sincere student, if you're walking around with one of these contaminants or all three or all four, excuse me, three out of the four, or four out of the four, or two, one out of the four,
Mhm.
your practice, the very range or depth that you're able to go in the journey called yoga, is profoundly affected. And then also your relationship to the world, you know,
Mhm.
we are relational animals. So that's the double whammy, just to be really clear in what you're addressing. So what are these four contaminants, Natalie?
The first is animosity. And so it's this anger that overcomes us often when we see someone else maybe having what we think ought to be ours. So often very directly linked to that which we are attached to and that which we have an aversion to. Animosity comes out as anger that often expresses itself um, violently, whether that's violent thoughts, violent words, or violent actions. Um, and do we want to talk about the antidote for it or come back?
Why don't we list the four just so everyone who's listening has, we can see the terrain.
Okay. Animosity is the first. The second is cruelty. This is one that I find particularly compelling, and I think really sticky as well because I think very few human beings want to self-identify as cruel. And yet, this contaminant lives in all of us. It manifests in more subtle ways, perhaps, or it manifests when we're not behaving consciously, when we're triggered or upset or something. And then this knee jerk reaction, this whatever it happens to be, that's when the cruelty comes out. And it's often directed toward people who are already suffering. So, pardon my language, but it's that concept of shit rolls downhill. When we're suffering, we then look for someone else that is weaker that we can then inflict harm on, because they're the easier prey.
Yeah.
And whether that cruelty comes out as, killing a bug that dared to cross the threshold into your home, or it might show up as a lack of impatience, or almost a dehumanization of a server at a restaurant, or your Uber driver, or anyone that at least subconsciously your mind dubs as inferior or
Yeah.
already suffering.
Hmm.
We tend
I
to
think
find
I,
suffering.
I think it's really helpful you describe cruelty the way it is. And just to be clear, because again, not many of us, and I'm assuming who's taking the time to listen to you and I prattle on about yoga, um, and the subtle nuances of these four veils that darken the mind, is not inherently a cruel person. But what becomes evident quickly when you begin to dive into the actual practice, as it were, related to these four, the contemplative, or even we could call them a process of self-inquiry, to heal them, is that cruelty is not necessarily an aggressive or overt act. It could be the withholding
Mm-hmm.
of kindness. And this is, I think, one of the tragedies of the emphasis of kind of non-violence. Many people think of, like, if there's a preeminent uh, guiding principle about how we behave morally within yoga, it's this principle of ahimsa, which himsa means violence, and ahimsa means not acting out violently. So then there's this, I think, what we draw from, what many people draw from that, and I did, to be very honest with you, for a long time. As long as I'm not actively harming you, I'm practicing ahimsa. And that, for all intents and purposes, would not be wrong, because it's an ahimsa is a non-act.
Mm-hmm.
And what you are addressing, and what this aspect of the sutra is addressing, is it's not a non-action. It's even passively being less than caring. I'm even going to go wild and say tender. To understand that we're walking around with other human beings who, generally speaking, are as hurt and afraid as we are, and to either consciously or unconsciously ignore that fact is actually an act of cruelty. As you rightly said, it begins by even withholding care and tenderness toward ourselves, even the acknowledgement that you and I are walking around with pain. And in a sense, we're being cruel, using the same word used. We're actively being cruel to ourselves by not acknowledging our own pain and not acknowledging our own suffering. And then it becomes increasingly easy to project that onto others. Again, even if it's just a withholding of tenderness. And I've spoken to psychologists about this, and it's quite interesting because it's not an accident. We've actually been trained not to acknowledge our own hurts. And it's natural that we protect ourselves, particularly if we're continued in childhood. We couldn't acknowledge the way, let's say, our environment was not really tending to our needs. We couldn't acknowledge it in a way. It wasn't safe to acknowledge it. And very often we carry that on into later life. But I don't want to get bogged down. We still haven't gotten into the next two. But I really want to make the case that everyone considers the idea of, and it's often framed not just as cruelty, as Natalie offered, but it's also framed as the withholding of compassion. And maybe that's easier for some of us to digest. I'm not overtly cruel, but maybe we could, when we're thinking about it, yeah, maybe I do withhold compassion from myself. So yeah, so we'll move on in the other two. And the other thing I want you to, I'd love it if you could highlight, maybe we just read the sutra out loud.
Mm-hmm.
because it sounds like when you get to these four, then it says, in light of these four, what we should be doing or what we convert them into. And many people think that's an attitude. So, what's the opposite of cruelty? Oh, just be compassionate. Oh, I just have to take my inherent impulses to withhold compassion, and I just have to be compassionate. And I hope we get around to being able to address that because
Yeah,
it's not that simple.
absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely not that simple. it's it's an endeavor. Yeah, and what one other thing that I wanted to mention based on what you were saying is often those of us who like to think of ourselves as good people and not outwardly expressing anger and outwardly expressing cruelty, we often internalize it. So when we're feeling angry, if we don't feel like it's safe or accepted to be angry in the world, then it gets swallowed. And that anger then does a tremendous amount of harm internally. Similarly with cruelty, if the impulse toward cruelty arrives, but it's not acceptable in the moment, then we will often inflict that cruelty on ourselves. And I can absolutely speak to having that be
Mm-hmm.
very present in
Mm-hmm.
my past.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, number three is jealousy. Um, and again, jealousy is not something that most of us would freely admit to experiencing, but it's fascinating how prevalent it really is. And I also find interesting that, at least in Panditji's commentary on this, he's referring to a specific kind of jealousy, which is this like jealousy of another person's um, spiritual prowess or like moral elevation, jealous of another person being a better person than we are, being more spiritually accomplished or gaining more spiritual recognition or closer to God, if you will. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels like a very specific kind of jealousy that it almost like sits even heavier on the heart, because it seems to be reflective of like a very significant element of self-worth. If someone
Mm-hmm.
else is more worthy of the love of God, for example, or the spiritual praise or adoration of other humans, to be jealous of that in someone else, that feels like something that breaches the soul, not just the mind, not just jealous that somebody has a nicer car or something of
Right.
that nature.
Right. There's a gray area here for me because the more I reflect on that sutra, I almost lean into this being, and it's important you phrased it, by the way. The context is of a spiritual bent. So imagine again, this is for actual disciples, people who are actively engaged in making yoga part of their life. So you're going to be around various students and teachers of varying degrees of what appears to be accomplishment in a spiritual context, right? So I actually lean into the term envy more
Mm,
than jealousy. So my understanding is if you're jealous, it's something that you have that you feel as other people threaten.
mm,
Envy is something you don't have that you want. And so that level of accomplishment that, for all intents and purposes, maybe you're projecting, maybe it's real, that they have a spiritual level of achievement that you don't have that you want, that sounds more like envy to
mhm,
me. And if, on the other hand, you're worried that someone's going to take your spirituality away, that would be jealousy. I mean, just
mm.
using these two terms based on how their definitions in English. So, anyway, just a point of clarification for me.
Yeah,
Um, but the context is right. It's not about cars and material stuff. It's specifically around accomplishment or where they sit on, even if they appear to be more tranquil or more stable or more accomplished at the level of, again, practice, discipline, the fruits of yoga.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's one mention that Panditji has in his commentary that helped me really hone in on the presence and the influence of jealousy or envy. And envy, the way that you're defining it, is more aligned with what I mean.
Yeah.
is you may not be present to it in the moment because it may be masked by your own feelings of admiration for what this other person has accomplished or inspired in you.
Hmm.
But when we see that person fall
Hmm.
off of the pedestal
Hmm.
and there's a sense of giddiness or glee or I knew it or some sense of satisfaction when you see that person that you envied knocked off the high horse or whatever it happens to be. That really was like, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. Because I wouldn't have I wouldn't have thought of it as jealousy or envy before, but now I can see there's something really gross. There's something really gross in there, that is undeniable. And yeah, so that was a something that brought it together for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. And the fourth contaminant is self righteousness. And initially, when we talked about that, that one felt like the least problematic. It's like, oh, well, okay, whatever. Flash forward, and it's the one that I struggle with the most on a daily basis. For me, it's the most easy to justify and excuse because it basically reaffirms what a good person I am
Right.
by pointing out how other people are wrong or bad. And I mean, it happens all the time in the yoga world as much as anywhere else with things like, oh, well, I practice or I teach real yoga and whatever they're doing, blah, blah, blah. Even something like that, or any number of things. This holier than thou quality of, oh, I'm so pious, I'm so good, I'm so right, and putting someone else down. That feels like a more subtle, but potentially more pervasive self righteousness. And then we have the more blatant identifying someone else as a sinner and just flat out a sinner because they are living uh, a life that is in direct conflict with our belief system. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking about having this chance to talk to you about these four, and way back when I presented this content in 2018, since that time, I've spent a lot of time in neuroscience. Really, it was just an area I knew very relatively little about. I spent a lot of time in chakras and yogic philosophy and structures of the mind according to Vedanta. But it's perfectly okay to update teachings based on as more knowledge becomes comes online. We don't I'm not going to shut the door on neuroscience, quantum physics, medical care. We're not. But the more you understand these four, the more you recognize them, the more you see our brains are fundamentally use these various veils that darken perception as they were part of our evolutionary biology. They actually were in place for a reason. This one that you're describing now around judgment and how quickly we pivot to self-righteousness, it's a tribal phenomenon. And this is one of the most basic neurological centerpieces of what helps us survive. Find the group, the in group, push away the out group, have a sense of belonging. By the way, that made survival more likely if we had an in group. And part of that, and this is actually considered one of the basic emotions, is disgust.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to understand that disgust is actually driven in part by the limbic system, our reptilian brain. This is how we go, no, they're not part of me. Does everyone see who I'm agreeing with? Does everyone see who I disagree with? And they've actually done neuroscientists have done some research about it. When we are self-righteous, when we are disgusted by other people, we get a little shot of dopamine. It actually motivates us. It inspires us. So imagine that. There's actually neurological reward system for expressing or feeling hatred for other people. By the way, the technologists figured that one out, and that's why hatred and anger pushes the algorithm up. And the more things they can put in front of you that you feel, oh, this is me or this is them, with a bit of what you were talking about, this self-righteous, self-indignation, this judgment, as it were. The more we can feel that, the more sticky it is, the more time we'll spend there, etc. So and I hope we get into this piece around now what cognitive behavioral therapy, which again is based on the neurological research about how human beings change, how we get to greater sense of freedom. It's almost like Patanjali was providing, it's a almost a 2,000-year-old model of cognitive behavioral therapy about how we gain more choice, how we have greater free will, how we can experience greater amounts of tranquility in our life, and how we're not in just the same ruminative loop that keeps us stuck. It's kind of the opposite, frankly, of what living yoga is all about.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, and I just wanted to bring in this idea that it's not our fault that we judge others. It's actually part of my little reptilian brain back there. Everything is routed through fear and anger.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really helpful to point that out because I remember for myself going through this, feeling a lot of shame and a lot of
Mm,
guilt over the fact that these contaminants were alive in me because I really would prefer to believe that they weren't. But I refused to let myself off the hook that easily. And so I dug to try to find their presence as much as I could so that I could heal them authentically. It's an ongoing process, day to day.
of
But
course.
that the element of extending compassion to ourselves requires that we refuse to give shame a foothold. And because I think shame is the killer of compassion, and especially self compassion, but it also kills our ability to be compassionate toward others when we're stuck in that shame dungeon. And so it's very helpful to recognize that much of what we would consider less than ideal behavior is rooted in our survival. It's rooted in built in animalistic survival techniques that
100%.
have worked. And so they are part of our evolution. And so our call, I think, on the spiritual path is not to condemn ourselves, but to recognize that there is more that is possible and to move in that direction.
100%. Well said. And just to be clear, anyone listening to this probably has some interest. What I'm about to say, I think, should have some meaning. The fact is that our brains are not built for freedom. The departure from the more primitive responses to life it's truly that. Is this shift to yoga is a radical departure out of our more animalistic and basic nature.
Mhm.
The brain is built for survival and propagating our genes. That's what it's built for. This whole cognitive revolution in which we develop these massive societies, complex social structures, architecture, engineering, all of this stuff is a departure out of the animalistic orientation.
Mhm.
And so, if we understand that the brain itself operates fundamentally from core principles, core survival principles that were steeped in an environment that was rooted in scarcity. And granted, there is scarcity, there is suffering in the world, there is privilege and underprivilege. There's, developed nations and underdeveloped nations. The point is that our brains developed in scarcity environments.
Mhm.
So we were afraid. And that's where negativity bias plays in and why we like why we like donuts, why we like fat and sweet. I mean, there's all sorts of fundamental reasons why human beings taste that, like to emphasize or lean into specific tastes, lean into specific cultural emphases, anger, fear, those are all biological.
Mhm.
This shift, however, to freedom, to self-reflection, to consciousness, to awakening, if you will, to the higher mind, that is asking the brain to do something different than its normative default kind of operations.
Mhm.
So what we're talking about, and I think anyone listening, and what I'm going to ask you to do, Natalie, because I we discussed this, you have the sutra in front of you. Maybe we can read it because some people may get off this listening to this and go back to it, and if we haven't said it out loud, maybe it'll be a little confusing, and we can just then comment on the actual sutra itself, going from
Yes.
there.
And
Okay.
just the sutra, not the commentary.
Yeah, just the sutra with
Yeah,
people.
otherwise we'd be here
We'll
for
be,
a
we'll
while.
be the commentators today.
Okay,
People,
excellent.
yeah.
I just want to point out how well loved this book is, and that this, oops, already dropping pages, this portion from basically 133 through the end of 136 is just falling out of the book. Much visitation. Anyhow, transparency of mind comes by embracing an attitude of friendliness, compassion, happiness, and non judgment toward those who are happy, miserable, virtuous, and non virtuous.
Okay, so let's match them up for people. So we're going to be friendly to those who are just based on, so it's like, when
Yes.
I'm just,
Friendliness
to
toward
the,
those who are happy,
right.
and compassion for those who are miserable, happiness for the virtuous, and non-judgmental toward those who we deem as non-virtuous.
All right. I just think that really spells it out where it's telling us, okay, this is what, when you meet people on the road of life who are happy, who actually elicit anger in you, you need to cultivate friendliness. When you meet people who are miserable, who you typically would um, feel a lack of compassion for, or um, who aren't meeting your expectations, let's just say, you're going to extend compassion toward. When you're meeting those who are virtuous, this was this envy, jealousy distinction we made. These that are virtuous, we're actually going to experience happiness for them. And then finally, this last grouping, which is the those that who are non-virtuous, and I'm sure everyone listening can come up with one or two people they think are not virtuous, possibly the devil incarnate or whatever we perceive. It's vital that we learn to be non-judgmental to those people. And remember, this is very utilitarian. It's it's to our benefit. It's the benefit of our practice, and it's the benefit of us moving through the world with more grace and more freedom.
Mhm.
Now, the thing I'd like to point out, if it's okay, I'll just take the lead on this, and I want you to comment. Probably for at least 20 years, I read that, and the assumption was, and you touched on something earlier that I think is quite relevant. The assumption was, oh, so I just have to change my attitude. I just have to change my attitude. And that means that when, let's just using that last example of someone who's really not a good person, there's so much evidence that I have that this is not a good person. I have to be non-judgmental. Okay, I get it. Okay, so now, again, good yoga boy or yoga girl, this is the attitude that this seminal scripture is saying you must. So now what happens? And I think this is actually a very tricky part that was I think one of the most important things that come out of this conversation is it's not an attitude shift. That is actually suppressing the cause of that's actually pushing it down. And it's saying if I just blanket if I just create this aura of non-judgmental, of being non-judgmental, or an aura of compassion, then I'm doing the sutra, right? Because that's what it would appear is the case.
Mm.
And I'd love to hear you comment on that because where this becomes what I said earlier, cognitive behavioral therapy, as outlined by the ancient tradition, because we don't actually change by trying to overlay an attitude on internal conflict and a lack of internal resolve.
Mhm.
That's not how the brain works. And we will continue deep down to ruminate or to spin on these, these ancient patterns of judgment and withholding compassion and being cruel to ourselves or others, withholding love, etc. There is a process that's critical, and only at the end of that work does this shift in attitude spontaneously arise. The change in the attitude is the result of doing something.
Yeah.
And if you try and just force the attitude that you think is yogic onto it, you'll actually perhaps be burying the conflict even more deeply into your consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. There are some catchphrases that I think could be applicable in the modern, like the new agey spiritual world, spiritually bypassing and imposter syndrome. If you feel like an imposter, it's very likely that there's something that is lacking authenticity. And
Mm. Hmm.
our own growth often is the thing that is lacking the authenticity. And again, that's not me trying to be judgmental because I'm also that person. Or I'm not even trying to be judgmental of myself, but just it's another part of, I think, our survival of let me just do this quickly and get it over with and move on. Because really digging in to try to find out the roots from which animosity or cruelty are growing, that's incredibly uncomfortable. And it takes a lot of perseverance to do that kind of um, deep discovery. And then often it feels like we're inviting more discomfort than the discomfort that was at the surface level with the cruelty or the animosity in the first place. But the end result of it is greater freedom.
Mhm.
I feel like I'm speaking in riddles a little bit. So we'll,
I don't think so. I mean, again, I really think the neuroscientific model is helpful. The point is that taking on overlaying a positive attitude or an attitude that we think is more yogic doesn't actually change our relationship to the thing. It buries it deeper. And again, what do you call it? The double whammy. Let's just keep emphasizing this. This is self-serving. It's not only, it's self-serving because it's going to transform your practice. What really I think is meaningful and what I probably said back in 2018 along with this teaching was that the self is the self. The destination is the destination. We're not changing the destination. We're not in any way influencing the destination. If you want to call the destination divinity or God, you've alluded to it in that context before in this call, um, or its essence, or its Mahamudra, it's this supreme state of emptiness, however we want to describe it, or it's the light of the universe, or it's luminosity. There's so many beautiful ways of describing what is the headwaters, the source of being, right? It's going to give us better access to it if we're resolving this stuff, and it's going to change our relationship to the world so that we're carrying less of a burden as we move through the world. That's the point of what we are trying to do. And please, what will start to become evident as one starts to engage the process holistically, as it relates to not just trying to overlay a new attitude on your existing unrest around these four things, but as you organically begin to uproot them, and I hope we let's speak into that, right? There's three processes. One is to recognize that, hey, I have animus. There's things or people I have loathing toward, a dislike toward. There's things that I am withholding of love from, including myself. There's things that I continue to be envious of. And there's things that I continue to judge, as you've so, honestly and transparently described. And by the way, so have I. I will say that this is an ongoing thing. In fact, one of the great shifts for me was to realize, oh, just because you get to a level of stillness in your meditation doesn't make them all go away. In
Yes.
fact, it's the opposite. No. So the point is that number one is acknowledgement. Number two is tracing it to its source. And the source is not the world. This is a big pivot, Natalie, and you know it well. I see you nodding because I know experientially you know it. The source is in me.
Mhm.
It's not the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's not immigrants or not immigrants. It's as many of the deep polarities facing us in America, at least, or the world these days. It's not them. The conflict is me. This is the Buddha's teaching. It's all empty. We assign its meaning.
Mhm.
But the point is, number one is acknowledge that you have these feelings. And that's huge. And there's a process for doing that. Number two, beginning to trace it to the source. Those root thoughts, those root associations I have to that person or to myself. And only when we begin to uncover and contextualize the source of that unrest, the source of that projection, does it begin to lift. Now, you earlier, sorry, I want to let you comment, but earlier you used the word, I used the word tenderness.
Mhm.
It's only in this tender spaciousness of accepting these parts of ourselves that we all have a tendency, me included, we all have a tendency to disclude. So much easier to figure out who deserves my loathing in the world, but harder to recognize my own loathing, harder to recognize where I'm withholding compassion myself. And that's why tender acceptance is one of the key points of when you find the source in you, you begin to bring a new context of understanding to them. And this is what begins to change, literally change the brain. You're now beginning to introduce new associations. And instead of having, if I say a name of someone who I've had deep disagreement with, or I look at it and I see this is just the worst being, and it produces that ripple of hatred, that ripple of judgment, that ripple of cruelty. The only way I can do it, this is how the brain learns through repetition. Once I've repeated enough times, it's in place. Doesn't matter if I meditate and it all goes away for a little while. The moment I open my eyes and I read the news, he's back, right?
Mhm.
It's back. I need to create a new association. Now, instead of it just cycling in this thing called the default mode network, now the hippocampus begins to record that Rod or Natalie or whoever is doing this process has a different relationship. And I begin to overlay the healthy response, the sustainable response, and my hippocampus goes, oh, I can breathe with love here. And that becomes our new default. Is that, I'm hoping that makes some sense and I'm not going too far into this.
Yeah, it is making sense. Um, and I was, so you said step one is acknowledgement that they exist. And I would slip in step like 1.5
Mhm.
of also acknowledging the impact that their existence is having on us.
Mhm.
Because the work that is going to be asked of us to essentially reprogram our relationship um, is not easy. And so we have to really be as cognizant as possible of the limiting, the binding, the tightening, the contracting, the confining impact that that way of being is having, like repressing our humanity, oppressing ourselves in essence as well. So really taking a hard look at what is the effect that this way of being is having on me individually and having on my ability to be the person that I want to be in the world so that I can have enough oomph behind my desire to heal. Otherwise, you're going to check out so quickly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's not easy. The Buddha described it as against the stream. It's not easy.
Mhm.
Transforming ourselves is. Listen, in my book, I wrote this line. I said, the hardest pose is change. It's much harder than even leg behind the head back when that was even modestly important, but not that it is now at all. But the point is, change is hard. And so, to the point you made, Natalie, which is a brilliant one, is to say, understand the stakes, understand the cost of not healing it. So once you acknowledge, like, yeah, I still have anger. I have anger. And by the way, I also want to say, there's a certain, it seems as though we're talking about an altruism. Step into compassion, step into kindness, step into happiness, step into non-judgment. It sounds so damn uh, altruistic. It doesn't mean you can still have boundaries.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you have to live with, or start to make friends with perpetrators or people who've abused you or, people who are fundamentally wrong. Doesn't mean you have to have dinner tomorrow night. But how much space do they occupy in your mind? Because believe it or not, when you meditate, if they're in your mind in your waking state, they are inherently blocking the light of perception even when you meditate. And those of us who've done this work with these four contemplations know the difference not doing the work does on the quality of meditation versus doing the work and then going into meditation.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also,
So I love 1.5. 1.5 is know the cost. What's the toll? What's the
yeah.
toll?
Yeah. Um, Something else that just came through in terms of like what you were saying in terms, it's not just about altruism, and we still have boundaries and we still can recognize right from wrong and how we want to engage with that. Right
Mm.
from wrong on the level of our conscience, like the information that our discernment is delivering to us about what is right or wrong for us, and then how we live accordingly. Um, I would suggest as well, particularly in light of what is unfolding in the United States, that someone might listen to this conversation and think that we are suggesting ignore, don't get involved, um, be passive, whatever that might be. And I don't want to speak for you, but I want you to speak for you. I'll speak for me in this regard, that I feel that doing this work allows us to stay in more constant contact with our own conscience and the impact that we as an individual human being want to have on the world. And that then empowers us to navigate situations like what is unfolding in the United States, in a way that is a direct expression of who we choose to be in the world. And so when we are standing up for what we believe to be right or standing against what we believe to be wrong, that we are still doing so without the contaminant of animosity. There may be the presence of rage that flows up and through us as a healthy response to something that we are witnessing or experiencing that can come up and flow through and inform us. Okay, my body is telling me this is not okay. And so now I'm going to let go of the animosity then being attached to a particular person or people group. And I'm just going to be present. I am not going to allow my fear to uh, cause me to behave with cruelty or violence or whatever it happens to be. I can be actively involved, but I can be actively involved in a way that agrees with my conscience and doesn't harm me and doesn't cause harm to anyone else, even when I might be actively involved. Again, I wish I was able to say it a little bit more clearly, but this is what I'm trying to express, that it's not take yourself out of the game and sit on the sidelines. That's not what this is requesting. It's be the fullest embodiment of who and what of your essence
Yeah.
in the way that you engage with the world.
Yeah. No, I thought it was very clear. I thought what you said was very clear, and you didn't want to speak for me, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. I'll just offer this. There was a famous, I mean, not a famous, but a standout line that I heard early on when in my studies when I met Panaji. But his teacher actually once said that a disturbed mind is unfit for any path. And what I would offer is that while anger is a strong motivator, uh, and there's a reason, again, an evolutionary necessity, why anger, what anger does. It's about stopping, either creating a boundary or pushing against the boundary that's being imposed. But sustained anger is not, chronic anger or enduring anger is not sustainable. It depletes and debilitates our own nervous system. We're not meant to hang out in anger.
Mhm.
And furthermore, I think more to the positive description or the positive messaging you just provided is that if I am going to listen to conscience about the best way that Natalie, I, or Rod, I, can respond to the present moment, I can't be steeped in any one of these four veils.
Mhm.
It's actually, and this kind of speaks into this idea of what is the inherent nature of things. We'll go back to a little bit of a yoga thing, and what I will say is that nature, notwithstanding human beings and how we do our dance, and there's all sorts of flowing with nature, flowing against nature. Unfortunately, I think we're moving very much away from nature's intelligence. But what is the natural essence of things? And again, we hear various messaging. We hear messaging, but it overlays again and again, and that there's inherent knowingness. A seed in nature has all of the intelligence to be the fullest version of itself. Tomato, pumpkin, acorn, all of it holds the intelligence to be the best, fullest version of itself. Even when things come and impede that journey to the best self, it still's pushing to be its best self. Human beings have that. And there's knowledge within the cells of my being that tell Rod how to be the best Rod, that tell Natalie how to be the best Natalie. Do I always go with it? No, but the more often I do, the better for me and for everyone else. And the other thing is that essence is also described again and again. The Buddha described it as karuna. Karuna is meaning compassion, and that does not mean an attitude of compassion. What he was actually saying is that the source of being itself is a binding intelligence that is love,
Mm.
that holds all the cells of our body together. The point being that when the mind gets quiet, when it's not tainted by these four veils, I know what to do. And there's inherently a link to the greater order that we are all a part of. Clearing the mind of these contaminants tells me how to be, how to show up for the world, a world that is often and what may eternally be at a certain level of conflict. How do I do that? And lastly, I'll just say I've known too many social activists who've relied on anger to motivate them, and they burn out.
Mm.
They struggle. There's too much in the world to be angry about these days. How do you work with anger in a positive way? Find out that it lives in you. And even those things that you want to change, can you do it without enduring the enduring burden of anger and or any one of these other three contaminants?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I'm glad we took some time to describe that. You know what might be interesting, Natalie, if maybe you would start and just I think maybe it's meaningful because it's a bit of an eye opener, I think, the first time you hear it. Earlier, I said step one is acknowledgement. You added step two, understand. Uh, point 1.5 was understand the implications of you of this particular veil in your in presence present in your life. And then I said step two, trace it to its causes. So it might be interesting if one by one we could just go kind of efficiently so people could understand what is the cause of anger
Mhm.
toward those we've described as perhaps happier or more successful of us. What is the cause of us withholding compassion? The cause of the very root. What is that? Because there's a hunger, all of them, in a way, again, bear out the Buddha's teachings. They're all a form of clinging to something. The cause of our own suffering is invariably a clinging. But there are certain teachings in this that are meaningful. What's the cause within us of being, uh, uh, we'll say, judgmental, etc.? So, do we want to go through that one by one? Do you think
I
that
think
might
it
be
can be
meaningful?
really helpful. That
Yeah.
was for me, that really helped me to get insight as to like where does this come from and then give it some context. And that was very powerful in like, personal reflection.
Mhm.
So I'm going to do my best to remember them and then I will lean on you as well.
All right, let's go.
My understanding of the cause for animosity is that it's linked very much to what we are attached to and what we are averse to and what we almost what we feel entitled to, what we feel we deserve, and not getting it, not getting what we want and getting too much of what we don't want. And that's obviously unpleasant. And then we see reflected in someone else, whether it's real or just something that we're projecting, the image of someone who has what we want or doesn't have what we don't want. And there is then anger that can be targeted or directed toward them. And it gives us an outlet for our own disappointment in life, for not getting what we want and getting too much what we don't.
Yeah.
And an example of what that can look like might be someone who feels alone, isolated in the world, feels like the world has maybe left them behind. There's no opportunity for them. They can't find a meaningful relationship, and um, they feel irrelevant, perhaps. And then they might see someone else who is smiling and being embraced by their child and walking into their home, hand in hand with someone and seems to be embodying everything that that person wants, but all of the wants and desires that are unfulfilled. And that person then may become the focus of that animosity. And then if someone else behind the scenes says, yes, you're absolutely right,
Yeah.
it is that person's fault
Yeah.
that you don't have what you want.
Yeah.
They are to blame.
Mm. Yeah, and as you're saying this, Natalie, I've just suddenly, it just kind of, I got this wave of how hard this work is. Because, self-righteous anger is not always wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always wrong. I mean, if a woman has wanted a child her whole life and now just through her own fertility issues and nothing she did purposefully can't have a child, and she sees someone with a child and it produces a wave of anger.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a lot. It's a big lift, man,
Mm-hmm.
to come into this place. Oh, I'm supposed to feel friendly. I'm supposed to feel, happy, friendly toward them. That doesn't feel at all organic. Not at all. So I just want to again acknowledge as you and I have this conversation, remember these are deep, even neurological underpinnings. Um, so you're right. It is attachment, attachment to others' success, attachment for others' recognition. There's some people who apparently don't seem to have worked as hard as we have and have seemingly more than we have. wow, man, it's it's understandable that we're angry, that we're frustrated, and they become the source of our frustration. We have now somewhere to aim it, you
Mhm.
know. So I just want to again, one, we've now entered into the conversation and part of the conversation that really begins to address the lift of these practices that describe what is involved in recognizing the source. It's not to say a part of you isn't legitimately feeling anger. Yes, of course you are, and it's real to you.
Mhm.
But and I think we've made the case prior to having this part of the conversation, why the double whammy, as it were. It'll be called the double whammy from now on. The point is that your practice depends on it, and you moving through the world with more grace depends on it.
Mhm.
Your fluidity with relationships, and perhaps in this instance, and I experience this, becoming more fluid around my own success and my own creativity and my own ambitions, less attachment, and being willing to invest more into that happening and less in how I regard those who have what apparently I want. The moment I do that, I, there are new resources that come online
Mhm.
that pivot me to being more actualized in the very things that I'm hoping to achieve, right?
Yep. Yeah. That makes me think of the role of self responsibility, uh,
Hmm.
being able to recognize that no one else has the power to make you unhappy unless you give them that power.
Right.
And so much of our perpetuated suffering,
Hmm.
we have to take some responsibility for.
Yeah.
That sucks. That acknowledgement is very difficult. And it's why most people don't do it. But what it affords you, if you're willing to take responsibility for the ways in which you have perpetuated your own suffering, for example, that affords you the opportunity to recognize that you can also create your own happiness. That is your power. No one else can create happiness for you, but you
Yeah.
absolutely can. And so then rather than investing all that energy outward saying it's their fault that I'm suffering,
Hmm.
you can suddenly say, okay, I'm no longer going to dump all of that valuable energy. I'm instead going to turn it inward, reinvest it in creating a reality that I am happy with, that I find fulfilling, and that brings me freedom.
I think it's also, yes, well said. And I think a way of describing that in my mind is as you're saying it, it's a way of um, um, directing or redirecting your power.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so dissipated by really assigning this meaning onto this person, and it's actually giving that person more power as opposed to taking that power and investing it in your own development. Aside from what the promise of the sutra is, oh, you'll experience transparency of mind, which means you'll be reminded of your innate sthiti or calm or presence or equanimity. So yes, it's going to give you more equanimity, but there's a potential that it'll actually create more momentum toward the goal you're seeking that also then winds up being, by not seeking it, not actively invested in it, or not invested in entirely, that becomes the stuff that you project on and becomes the cause of this resentment to someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was helpful. So can we go to compassion? What's the cause of the withholding of compassion, or as we've described it early on accurately, is cruelty?
Cruelty. I think this one's very linked to survival.
Mhm.
And in order to survive, we need to be more powerful than someone else.
Mm.
So to be the most powerful, the superior one with the most resources, the most might, the most strength, we then need to put or push or force others down. We need to create systems of oppression that keep us in the position of power and everyone else essentially at our mercy. Um, so that it's a fear of annihilation, I think, that creates this desperate need to accumulate more and more power.
Mhm.
And that need for power then justifies cruelty. And then the cruelty also serves the purpose of inflicting harm and suffering and making other people's lives more difficult so that they can't rise and challenge our position of power.
Yeah, again, I'm as you're describing it, gives me a chance just to hear it, you naming it. And again, I'm overwhelmed in a way by by um, the requirement that this takes of us, what it asks of us is really profound. These are extraordinary inflection points. I can't stress that enough. Natalie, what Natalie just said is that this desire to dominate is intrinsic. Again, it's like back here again, it's in my brain. And, and again, in a scarcity environment, our life depends on that, right? But we're not, few of us are in that. So at the same time, what I want to do is just bring the inner work of this because as Natalie described in the very beginning, it also is reflective, cruelty is also reflective of, in a sense, um, it's an interrelate. It's not just interrelationship, but it's also intra.
Mhm.
It's also there's this tendency to dominate, and I can speak for myself, which is frankly, I probably got into yoga as many, all those decades ago because there were parts of myself I just didn't really want to. I thought if I did enough yoga, I meditated enough, got deep enough that I never had to deal with the parts of me that were hurt, that were carrying psychological scars, existential scars, karmic scars, whatever. And I thought, well, if I can just float on the cloud of samadhi my whole life, then I won't have to. And the moment I started this work in earnest, and I realized that I had been withholding compassion to myself and to the parts of me that I had been unattending to, not attending to. I understood what this sutra was about in as much as, oh, I have been not attending to, I've been wanting to dominate the hurt, the sensitive, the vulnerable, the the feelings of inadequacy that were deep buried within me. And so I would love our listeners to just understand that this is also a relationship to oneself. It's also to what extent do you choose to dominate elements of you? This is why early on I introduced the word tenderness. Can I become tender around the parts of me that I would prefer to dominate? And here's a fascinating thing, I think, and it's a bit of a catch-22, if you will, which is the very things, the very inclination to protect you from experiencing the hurt that you hold inhibits, it's a restrictor to you discovering your innate joy.
Mm.
Those two things go hand in hand. You can't know the totality, we'll say the volume and the breadth of the innate joy while a part of you is protecting and partitioning you from having to experience other parts of you.
Mhm. Yeah.
So again, this maybe we're leaning into a triple whammy now. Um, yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. So who do we withhold compassion from? First ourselves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll just again one more thing, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about it. If you get skilled at this, and you truly and you truly become experience like there's nothing I have to protect myself from. I can learn to love the unloved parts of me. What happens is it becomes increasingly uncomfortable to withhold compassion for others. That's what actually evolves. Yes, it's about you, but that relationship to the inherent the self-love, if you will, the self-care. The response to that is that you are no longer passive about others, that there's an innate caring. It's not just withholding violence, it's actually how do I expand kindness? And there's a gorgeous poem I came across in the past year. People can look it up. Kindness, I've forgotten the writer's name. It's a beautiful poem, and it talks about the linkage between kindness and sorrow. And
Mm.
when we know sorrow, then its twin, kindness, can fully express itself and understand that kindness is following us throughout our life, waiting to be known. But only when we accept our sorrow can kindness show us the extent to which it wishes to breathe itself in us. And I would say that's what this part of the sutra reminds me of.
Yeah. Yeah. In addition to Sutra 133, I have a specific tenet that I return to repeatedly, and that is love all, hate none, embrace all, exclude none. And for me, that has to be applied first and foremost to the various aspects of ourselves. And this is a huge part of what my understanding of this approach to tantric yoga, the spiritual path, as I have been, guided by my teachers in this tradition, is this creating, setting the stage for falling fully in love with every aspect of myself, and that
Mhm,
that's really the only way through.
mhm,
Um, I similarly had parts of my personality that did not, they weren't welcome. They were not
mhm,
welcome in who I wanted to be and how I wanted to present myself to the world. And so I locked those hurt parts of myself away in various little dungeons in my psyche. And while they were still, untended with open wounds, they continued to wreak havoc on my experience of life, whether I was willing to acknowledge them or not.
mhm,
They would show up when I would lose complete consciousness and go into reactivity. Um, and it was never oppressing them, denying them, neglecting them, starving them, keeping them locked in a cage in the dungeons of my own psyche was never going to be the way forward. And so I have such clear memories of sitting on the floor of the shala in Bali and traveling internally to one of those dungeons and just sitting with the version of myself that was locked in there, and
mhm,
just sitting and just trying to, first of all, be able to stomach its presence, and
mhm,
secondly, try to understand, seek to understand. And then the seeking to understand led to a seeking of acceptance. And then eventually, acceptance led to a genuine desire to want to embrace with love. And
mhm,
as I have been able to embrace those hurt parts of myself and welcome them back into the whole, my it's so difficult for other people to hurt me now.
mhm.
Whereas before it was quite easy because one little word would trigger one of those hurt parts in me, and then I would be in reactivity. And similarly, from the perspective of someone who tries to hold space for other people while they're going through their spiritual growth,
Mhm, mhm,
my ability to sit with all of the hurt parts in myself has
mhm,
made it possible for me to sit with other people and their shame and their pain and their regret and remorse without
mhm.
without being triggered by it, and thus without causing a scene in essence, of just being able
Yeah,
to
yeah,
hold steady space for someone else to go through a similar process. And that feels like a superpower, and for me that is part of what is at stake. it's
yeah.
it's
You go
yeah,
ahead. I'm sorry, didn't mean to
just that
interrupt you.
it's
Yeah.
vitally important for me to be able to provide that service to someone else, And so,
100%.
yeah, so
100%.
that
By
the
Go
motivation.
ahead. But yeah, by expanding our inclusion of, and not partitioning the
Mhm.
good from the bad within ourselves. Okay, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. Um, what I'm hearing you describe, Natalie, is resilience. And this resilience, the world isn't going to get suddenly nice. The people that I encounter as a friend or as a teacher, as a guide, it, not there's no all of the problems going away. There's just consistently dealing with the challenges as they come up in real time. And how can we show up for those people? How do we show up for ourselves? How do we show up for a world the best way we can on a daily basis? The work is never done because everything that comes, again, brain science, everything that comes up in the sensory cortex, the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, everything I see, hear, taste, touch, and smell is going to trigger fear or anger. The point is, what you're describing is having a different relationship to compassion, beginning with ourselves, makes us more resilient in this world. And if I may, I just want to say one thing, and I'm realizing, I don't know why this comes up, but I'm a little sensitive to it. Occasionally, what will happen is I'll do a post, an IG post. Occasionally, I'll do a post. And sometimes I get this response because I try and lean into the tradition and try and translate traditional thoughts like we're doing today, so that people can receive the benefits of them and do with what they ever want, whatever they want with them. But occasionally, and not infrequently, someone will say, "Who cares what you think? You're an old white guy." And they say it sometimes more cruelly, like they tell me to fuck off. And who cares? Fuck you. You suck. You're an old white guy. Who the fuck cares? Literally, that's the response. That's the comment I'll get once in a while, not a lot. So here we are. I'm an old white guy. You're a significantly younger and more beautiful white woman. Um, but I just want to say, so I'm also sensitive to the fact this our conversation could be interpreted as this very privileged repartee, tiptoeing into the sublime and da 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 da. I recently was listening to an amazing conversation between Richard Rohr, who some people will know is written some phenomenal books, and I believe he's an Anglican, a Franciscan priest, and Oprah was interviewing him for what he believes is his last book. And a man called into the show who worked in inner city. He was the not even a social worker, but he worked with gangs. And he had this quote that I thought was really compelling and really consistent with this context. So he's working with gang members who are trying to rehabilitate themselves, drugs, alcohol, crime, full on, anything but privilege, right? And he said, what I say about hoodlums is they're just young men who don't know how sad they are. And this is what this is talking about, is us becoming conscious of our sadness or our pain or our suffering. And to do so changes lives. His job is to embrace them. That's what he's describing, what he described, is to embrace them such that they can be comfortable acknowledging their pain. And that is what transforms a hoodlum into a man, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Number three,
Envy/jealousy.
we took on a lot today. This is we dove into it. We're swimming deep end ocean. I don't know when these laps are done, but let's just we'll we'll,
We'll just keep
we'll
going forward.
walk it through. Okay.
Yeah. Number three, envy, jealousy. I think it's rooted in our desire to be loved by God,
Hmm.
um, to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be validated.
Hmm.
Um, to be close to God. Um, and then potentially also validation of other humans to be seen as being close to God, to be
Mhm.
seen as holy, to be regarded by others as a good person.
Mhm.
And so when we see someone else who seems to be closer to God, more beloved of God, um, more spiritually inclined, it's easier for them to be a good person or whatever it happens to be. That that sense of lack for themselves generates a feeling of envy for what someone else has that they seem not to.
Yeah. Just for clarification, for those of you unfamiliar with the Yoga Sutras, I mentioned, I just want to repeat something I said in the beginning, and Natalie's very comfortable with the word God. But Patanjali wasn't that overt about it. He only mentions it in a couple places, and he mentions it in a very interesting way. So all I'm saying is that whatever Godhead represents, or the absolute represent, however it's represented to you, the Yoga Sutra can be used. It doesn't have to be as a religious God figure. It certainly doesn't call out any Hindu gods, just FYI. So uh, Natalie has a relationship to God, so she's very comfortable with it. But you don't have to have that same level of comfort. It can be actually literally treated as a methodology that requires no belief whatsoever, or
Yeah.
no quote unquote faith as we understand it.
Yeah.
Um, I love how you described it. It's fundamental. It speaks to a desire. It speaks to a desire specifically around, I'll use the word God. I don't use that a lot just because I know it alienates some people.
Mhm.
But what I was going to say is, it actually speaks to something really interesting, I think, in human nature, which is that how many of us really want to know God or the absolute, versus how many of us actually are longing for what we believe knowing God or the absolute will give us.
Mm.
And then what happens from that? And I would argue that most of us lean to the second.
Mhm.
What will knowing the absolute provide me? How will it? And it's part of what drove me in yoga for 4 freaking decades, constantly. I wanted to know it so that I could be whatever, better at whatever I did, and be it more peaceful or more creative or whatever. Figured out how to do fatherhood, whatever. I was hoping, the absolute would help me do that better. Um, and then what I would offer is that very often, no matter how far we are in the process, a certain level of doubt comes into us that we'll never get there.
Mm.
Then what happens is you meet people along the way who practice as much, maybe a little more than you do, or a lot more than you do. They seem to know more esoteric knowledge, perhaps, than you do. They maybe have more students than you do. They seem to be more disciplined. They seem more happy. They seem more, at least on the outside. And I would just say it's human beings' nature once again. We see the world through the prism of duality. That's just how it is. That's how the senses work. That's how my brain processes this information. And so immediately I think, a proclivity that we all have to look and believe others embody more of the greatness of knowing the source of life than we will ever know. And so immediately there's this, just even a little bit, there's this elevation. And the moment there's this elevation, on the one hand, it can be incredibly fortifying to know that someone's a little further, a little higher. And if you follow their higher further, you have a lot to gain. But that separation means that at any time, there's an underlying misalignment there that a part of us also should be uncomfortable with. Remember where we started, right? Where our brain's telling us we need to dominate. And yet we're kind of giving away that dominance, and it's not an equal footing thing. Super hard to have a teacher and not, they know more, they're better, they meditate more, they've gotten further in their meditation. It comes so easy. They articulate da 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 da. And no matter how little that division is, they're in front of the room, I'm facing them, I go to them for my problems. There's that distinction.
Mhm.
And a part of us will want to equalize that distinction. It will follow you throughout the process. And then, so Patanjali is creating this warning sign. And you spoke to that, that willingness to turn, that willingness to see downfall, that willingness to see, and not only perhaps willingness to see it, but actually contributing to it at some point in the game, if that should happen, if there's an opportunity. And by the way, it doesn't mean like full-blown cancellation or you turn the other way. One of the most insidious environments I've ever seen, talk about high school, ashrams.
Mm.
You love when the teacher gives you attention, when you're singled out as being, beloved and respected, you get your name mentioned, etc.
Mhm.
And then if the teacher hasn't acknowledged you for months and months and months, suddenly there's this deceit, this kind of ambivalence, this kind of. So anyway, I don't need to say any more about it. I think people understand that thing that happens that's super easy for us to do is actually the seed of what will become this perception, this envy, this growing, even while there's respect, there's this sister or twin interwoven into it is like, well, shit, I'm dismissing my own worth in this world that I want to get better in by having this high level, ultra level of respect that elevates them.
Yeah. Can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah.
I think it pertains. So again in Bali, I definitely recognize in myself that I love to be validated. So I love to like contribute and then be praised for my contributions.
Mhm.
And I was working on this in myself. Like, what is this seemingly voracious need for validation? And it was the second year that we were in Bali. And I remember I chose my mat right in the center, in the middle, so that I would be like clear view, so that every time I raised my hand, like you'd be able to see me and I would be able to get called on. And there was no mat for whatever reason right in front of me. I thought, perfect. Well, because there was no mat right in front of me, whenever we would start practicing, everyone piled their bolsters and blankets there. So there was like a fortress of bolsters and blankets directly in front of me so
Mhm.
that I had an opportunity to be with the discomfort of
Mhm.
he's physically not going to see you if you raise your hand. How's that going to go for you?
Funny. Funny.
And then later and especially for someone that we admire, the validation from someone that we look up to, it's a
Mhm.
heady thing.
Mhm.
And I remember seeing you outside on our way to lunch, and I was sitting on the back of the motorbike of a friend of mine, and I remember just wanting to have a moment with that feeling. And I remember just looking at you, and a voice inside of me said, "Everything you admire in him exists in you too." And I had this moment of, oh, got it. And that was probably the for me the moment of equalization
Mhm.
of now I can just be grateful for where he is and receive it, but that doesn't mean he's better than me or more beloved
Mhm.
of it's we're all we all have equal access to the divine. I always go back to that, but it was a moment of that for me. Yeah,
Number
ended up
one,
good.
everyone listening, that's the result of a person who practices. So she cut right through the envy thing and claimed the greatness was in her. And I would just add that if you, and I'm using the word greatness just to try and do this capture of maybe the meaning or the value we assign to someone else.
Mhm.
For us to recognize greatness in someone else, it's not from them. The recognition of greatness outside of us is actually coming from within.
Yeah.
But there's this lack of perceiving where that assignment is coming from.
Mhm.
There is, so bless my dog. Well, I don't know. My dog is an exceptional soul. I was going to say my dog is experiencing the greatness in me, not as a spiritual adept, but as someone who feeds him and walks him and loves him and pets him and this and that. And anyway, my point is that the greatness on that person that we're perceiving is actually us projecting it out. And people who are not interested in spiritual achievement don't do that. They see someone tall or short or wide or thin or whatever, or what are all the crazy beads and what's the bindi thing and what's the outfit and what's all that. It only has meaning to us who give it meaning.
Mhm.
And so the greatness is coming from us if we see it in someone else. It's us. Do we have we risen to that level yet? Maybe more than we know. And we certainly have it as a potential.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you comfortable doing the last one?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Self-righteousness is the word that seems to carry the most weight for me in terms of like
Mhm.
what it is that we're talking about as the contaminant. And there seems to be just some inbuilt tendency to need to know that you are better than someone else in some way. Particularly when you've got your own set of insecurities. If that, the more insecurities we're harboring, the more apt we are to point out flaws, lack of virtue in other people.
Mhm.
And there's just, I probably will need your help with this one because it is the one that
Mhm.
I wrestle with. But just this, it makes us feel better about ourselves when
Mhm.
we're able to point out the ways in which someone else is failing or wrong or
Mhm. Mhm.
less than.
Mhm.
And particularly on the level of like morality, being able to
Yeah.
say that's a bad person. And maybe I feel like I'm also bad, but
Mhm.
I feel better because I'm not as bad as they are. So if I can direct all of my energy and attention on how bad they are,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
don't have to deal with my
Mhm.
own
Mhm.
less than ideal nature.
Yeah. I'm hearing some sound in the background, by the way, Natalie. I don't know if your
Okay.
dog is getting restless or
That's Benny. He went down to
okay.
get some water. I'm going to up my noise cancellation.
That's all right. No worries. Um, yeah, I spoke into this a little bit in the beginning, and what I would just offer, again, it's super primitive. By the way, there's something I've been wanting to say again. I wanted to make sure it got into this call. Patanjali is very deliberate. There's nothing accidental. One has to really assume nothing is accidental in these teachings. Whenever there's a list, the last on the list is the hardest, the most subtle, the most endemic or intrinsic. So this is the one that requires the highest level of discernment. Judgment, as you're saying, so easy, so easy. Um, I spoke early on about the nature of wanting to belong as being such an intrinsic drive. If you didn't belong to a tribe, you didn't survive. All of us are the ancestors of the people who got essentially whose brains evolved to want to be in tribes because those are the people who survived. The other people didn't. They died off. The people who didn't want to be in tribes, they died. So the people who stayed in tribes had children, and we are the ancestors of the people in the tribes, which means that we will partition again the universe in what does the tribe want? How do I elevate my station in the tribe? How do I ensure my belonging? And one of the ways we do that is this, again, it's socio-neurological, it's evolutionary biology, it's real. It's like, okay, I'm I'm as aware of who's part of my tribe and their values as I'm aware of those who are not part of my tribe. In fact, who does my tribe dislike? Who does my tribe judge? Because there is this landscape in our world right now where you have two diametrically opposed points of view about the same phenomenon. And by the way, that's been going on since the beginning. Diametrically opposed interpretations of the same thing, person, place, or thing. And the issue of judgment speaks right into this. My perception, my tribe is right. Their tribe's wrong. As I said, we get off. There's some neurotransmitters that stimulate how we feel about ourselves when we identify, when we judge others, when we get into these conversations with people who are like-minded about how screwed up the other side is.
Mhm.
So again, this takes the shame out of it. It takes let's just be super biologically oriented and just go, this is the neurology of grouping and in crowd, out crowd, which again, neuroscientists describe and evolutionary biologists describe as a huge factor in how we see things. So, and once again, is any of who's right? Well, I want to believe I'm right. I want to believe they're wrong. And there's a rush in that. There's literally a rush, so a neurological rush, if you will. And yet, if you step back, we'll take the Buddha's deep synthesis of this, profound synthesis, and it's empty. No one's right, no one's wrong. We give it meaning based on our values, based on our beliefs, based on our programming, maybe because based on our family, maybe based on the stars. And the judgment, what that does is it reinforces our identity. And this is at the heart of clinging. At the most fundamental level, we cling to this belief that my perception of the universe is the right one.
Mhm.
It's all, you can't have identity without believing it's the right one at some level. Even if you're unhappy, you're believing your unhappiness is real.
Mhm.
You're, it's tied to your identity. So that's what this last one is. Again, I wanted the foreshadowing of it was this is the most subtle. It's the hardest one. Our judgment are wow, so tied into us. But if we can, as you were describing earlier, free ourselves from this final one, then we can move through the world with discernment, but without the weight, the burden of judgment.
Yeah.
And those are two very different things. And I would also argue that if you can get some glimpse of this, and by the way, I teach all of these contemplations as the opening into meditation. These aren't meditations, these are contemplations. And there's a process, as Natalie teaches, and I have taught, uh, for each of these, and it's work. And I suggest people have time with them. It doesn't happen in a day. Um, but then to do a contemplation and then to meditate, or to do a 40-day process of just one of them, say non-judgment or compassion, to come out the other side and see, wow, I can see the world and I can relate to myself, my wife, my kids, my coworkers, whatever it is, without judgment or with more compassion. But then to understand the contemplations are different than meditation, and then to, for instance, do a contemplation and go directly into meditation, it can be incredible. That's again Patanjali's invitation. These create the transparency of mind. so that what you're seeing is true, you know.
Yeah. And I'll add to that that doing an intensive engagement with them, like a 40-day or something, creates enough of a clearing that you become more quickly aware when they return, because they will return. They return with regularity. But our relationship with them changes. And with self-righteousness, for example, for myself, I feel like most of the time I'm able to go through life with a minimal amount of that self-righteousness, minimal enough that when it shows up with gusto, the dopamine hit is a very real thing. And it's almost like I've never snorted cocaine, but I could imagine it would be something similar to this feeling of just like this rush of like and wanting to just tear apart that other person and their behavior, and can you believe this, and blah blah blah. But similar to a drug that is a stimulant like that, it literally gives me a hangover. I feel
Yeah.
sick afterwards.
Hmm.
I feel
Hmm.
sick. I feel remorse. I feel like, who did I become in that moment? That
Hmm.
isn't, that isn't, it does not resonate with who I want to be. I feel like I have been contaminated. And that is motivation as well to change the way that I interact with the triggers for that judgment. Um, yeah, it just makes me into somebody that I wouldn't want to be around. I don't like being in my skin when I indulge in these contaminants.
Well, what you just described is really important, and I would just invite people. I want to highlight it, Natalie, because the point is that none of these are either physiologically beneficial. None of these. They don't help us. They actually tax our nervous system, speed up the aging process, they mess with our meditation, they mess with our tranquility, mess with our relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is not to, again, adopt the opposite virtue. So the opposite of anger is friendliness, withholding of compassion is compassion, et cetera. The object would be, as Natalie just described it, so I just want to emphasize your point, that you would become uncomfortable with them because it's our comfort with them. We become so familiar with them that we don't even see and recognize them as being toxic. The gift is when you see it and feel it the way you just described it. Oh, the aftermath of going into judgment or going into anger, you feel it. That's the ideal scenario. Remember, I don't know, I've had two times in my life have I tasted a cigarette. Once the first time it was deliberate. I had one. Anyway, it's a long story. I was 10 years old. I said I wanted to learn to smoke. My uncle put a cigarette in my mouth. I coughed my lungs out. I didn't have it again. And then the next time was sometime in my teenage years when I thought I was getting high on a joint and someone gave me a cigarette. And so that I've had two. I did inhale, but that was unfortunately tobacco. So I've never smoked since. But the point is, the first time I felt terrible. Most people, the first time you smoke a cigarette, you throw up. It's not unlike alcohol. The first time you drank alcohol, you got sick. It's toxic. These are toxic. What we want to do is have the clarity of mind that reminds us, like when this comes back into my consciousness, this does not feel good. And then it becomes, as I said, now the hippocampus has a new agenda and it just doesn't fit how we now feel. And so you can't carry this withholding, this cruelty of compassion, this withholding of compassion, et cetera. You can't carry it the same way.
Yeah.
We want to be sensitive to those things that are toxic. Again, not so we lose ourselves, not we become this airy-fairy, not in the world type of person, but just so that we have a different relationship to our own mind, our own purpose, and the power of discernment.
And I feel like it gives you the ability to be more fully in the world.
Totally,
So if
totally,
that's the aim,
totally,
to
100%.
to be fully in the world, engaged and having a positive impact, this work allows you to do that.
Love it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did we miss anything? Well, let's say, did we miss anything in this um, intention we both shared, which was to have a conversation that introduced people to the content, that explored it in a little more depth, that helped explain its importance and its significance in what is truly an overlooked or underappreciated element in the Yoga Sutras, and one of the more key points of it, because of where it is and what comes toward the end, which is the end of this, we'll say, section of the sutras, which is 136, is the culmination of it.
Mhm.
And that's really how to be freed of sorrow, how
Yeah.
to live without, how to live without pain, without suffering. And so this is an instrumental and integral part of living without pain.
Yeah. I think the last little notes that I would say, the way that I'm able to tell fairly quickly when the contaminants have slipped back in is by practicing every day.
Hmm.
Because and I say this as someone who resisted a daily practice for years, but
Hmm.
since it has become something that I just can't not do,
Hmm.
it sets me back at that place of peace and quiet and clarity, so that it's so much easier to recognize when something does creep in that doesn't belong anymore. And also, because I love the experience of being in meditation, I don't want I don't want to engage in anything that's going to disrupt it. So
Hmm.
I'm mindful of the kinds of movies that I watch because I know they're going to show up in my meditation the next morning. I'm mindful of the conversations that I have. I want to have a positive relationship with my parents because if I don't, I know that's going to show up in my meditation. I so that's another way for me to check and see how life is going, is the influence that my life is having on my practice, as well as the influence that my practice is having on my life. So that there's that for whatever it's worth. Um, and I think maybe a closing little element could be ways that we could check in with ourselves to evaluate the efficacy of our engagement with yoga philosophy and methodology. What are some signs and symptoms that things are going well in terms of how we start experiencing ourselves and experiencing life?
I'm shaking my head as you're asking that question, in as much as that's a hard one, maybe made more difficult by the world we live in today, where anger and fear have become so normative. It was about 10, even maybe 15, somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago, I started to say, oh, anxiety and depression are the new normal. So it would seem that if I'm not actually out committing hateful acts, or I'm not cowering under my desk every day or not getting out of bed, which I know some people, that's a real thing, then I'm doing okay. Then my practice is working. But those aren't right. Those aren't the right measures. What I would offer is that fear and anger and grief and shame are part of the human experience. And there is no finish line where they disappear. We're Again, I've really thrown into this conversation a lot of the neurology that I really now appreciate, and it just helps to understand this is how my brain interacts with the world. So these four, and I understand from my psychologist friends that disgust is actually considered an emotion and one of these primal emotions. So let's throw them in: anger, sorrow, fear, shame, and disgust. Know that they're around the corner. So I would offer, it's not the absence of those things. that determines the quality of your practice. It's how you relate to them when they arise. They're coming. It's nothing to instill fear. I'm not trying to instill fear in anybody, but just to state that the measure of your practice is how you relate to them. It's not about getting there into some sublime state that will last forever and you'll never be brought down into the human experience of these five states I just described. In fact, it's actually learning to be here with those five conditions and how, I don't want to say quickly because that starts to put a judgment on it, but how thoroughly you can transition out of those experiences. I'll say this again, neurology. Emotions last in our brain 90 seconds. That's the neurology. But they don't last 90 seconds because they loop into identity and default mode network. And then now we just repeat it every time. I guess at 89 seconds, we just rethink it. And that's literally part of the brain, the default mode network. So can you find those inflection points? Can you move out of them? And how long do you move out of them? We've been very thorough in our conversation today around the causes of each of them. Again and again, attachment comes up at some level, attachment or protection or division or tribal or whatever. The point being that they're going to come. You've been very honest about that, Natalie. I hope I have been too. There is no magic wand, no magic pranayama, no magic meditation that ensures they'll never come back. And if you think you know a human being for whom they're not coming back, I would tell you, I think you're wrong. They're coming back for every human being. Even those who've meditated 1,000,000,000 times in their lifetime. It's the elegance of moving out, the efficiency of moving out, and moving through life gracefully. And in the end, it's with joy. It's with this innate joy that arises not from the right conditions in our life, but by literally feeling the inherent joy that is the nature of being. We all own that. That is our birthright. We got it when we were created. And if we can remember that, if we can again go, despite the complexity and the conflict and the seeming unending division, I love my life. I love my life. And I love my life despite its complexity. To me, that's the sign the practice is alive. And the fluidity with your own emotions, the tenderness toward yourself and others, to me, that's the sign that the practice is working. We are, in Ram Dass's words, what are we? We're walking each other home. We belong to one another. And so I would say the extent to which you remember that, not to the point where you're avoiding being violent to other people, but that you can actively be kind. That's the primary sign that the practice is working.
Beautiful. Yeah.
How about you?
Probably a different way of saying the same thing. For a long time, I've heard this phrase, living in the world and yet remaining above it. I never liked the above it part because it made me feel like it was implying I'm above it all. So I've sort of swapped in phrases that I'm trying on for size, like unscathed by, or, undamaged by, or whatever that happens to be. And not untouched by, because I want to be touched by it. I want my heart to be touched. I want to experience my humanity fully. But I want to be so steady and so present and so at peace within myself, that I can be in the world with my eyes open and not have to flinch or turn away or hide or deny what is happening because I don't have the capacity to deal.
Yeah.
I want to be able to be present and at the same time stay very undeniably tethered to what you were just describing, which is that source of joy. So I'm able to experience the world, but at the same time remain always connected to the part of me that doesn't suffer and can witness suffering and can experience highs and lows as a human, but is also very firmly tied inextricably to the part of me that doesn't go through all of that. I had a moment of it the other day of fully giving my attention to something that had just happened that I found horrifying. And then putting it down, taking a moment to be with it, to process it, and came up the stairs, and my dog was laying on the bed, and he just made me happy. And so I sat down next to him and pet him and loved him. And it was joy that was untouched by the suffering that I had just given my full attention to out of respect, as out of a feeling like I need to give this my time and my energy and my attention.
Right.
And now I can put it away, and now I can go be genuinely joyful with my dog. That was like that Vishoka stuff that they talk about. It's real. And I have known that for a long time, but it was one of those moments of that's what it is for me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
thank you, Natalie. Thanks for inviting me into this conversation. And I'm appreciating the depths and the range of what we covered and the ease of it. And I also want to just acknowledge my appreciation for your willingness and your work with this, with these practices and these contemplations, and the depth of your understanding of them, and also the expression that is your life speaks to that embodiment. And so I'm deeply appreciative of it. They say that 1,000 people will hear it and one will understand it. Of the 1,000 people that understand it, one will practice it. And of the 1,000 people who practice it, so now we're at 100,000, one will embody it. So thank you for being one of those.
Thank you for introducing me to it in such a meaningful way. And also modeling by example.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're very welcome. I'm happy we stuck it out and kept following up and made it happen.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Look forward to talking soon.
Likewise.
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.